Hi everyone, I'm Sandy and welcome back to my channel. I am finally starting to feel a little bit better, so I thought I'd bring you a video today. A few weeks ago I did a video which was 50 books to read before you turn 50 according to Penguin Random House, and it was such an odd list of books. So what I thought I would do today is actually give you a list of 50 books that are some of my favorite books that I have read to celebrate my 50th birthday. Yay! And sadly, even though I hadn't read all 50 of those books, I still turned 50. So, but these ones I have all read, and they are some of my favorite books of all time. They're books that I've either rated 4.5 or 5 stars, and they are ones that I highly recommend and really, really loved. And so I have them broken up into kind of categories. And the first category is 1001 Discovery. So if you're not familiar, I am reading books off of the 1001 Books You Must Read Before You Die list. And so the first group of books is books that I only read because they were on that list, and they turned out to be ones that I absolutely loved. Okay, so the first one, and there's 50, so we're going to have to jump right in, otherwise this video is going to be really, really long. All right, so the first book is Animals People by Indra Sinha. And so this book was published in 2007. It follows a character whose name is Animal, and Animal has a very big disfigurement where he can't stand up straight, which is why he's given the nickname Animal. This book was fantastic. It has one of my favorite quotes of all time in it, and the quote is, "Hope dies in places like this because hope lives in the future, and there's no future here. How can you think about tomorrow when all your strength is used up trying to get through today?" Absolutely amazing quote. A great book, one I highly, highly recommend from the 1001 book list. So the next book is A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. This book was published in 1980 and I believe won the Pulitzer Prize also in 1980. This book was published posthumously. His mother was very critical in getting it, very essential in getting this published for him after he passed away. A very sad story. But this about the author, but A Confederacy of Dunces has one of my favorite characters of all time in it, of Ignatius J. Riley, who's this lovely character on the front. He is quite a disaster, and he is just hilarious. He goes through and does so many things and gets in so much trouble, everything from inciting a riot to how he files to his valves. If you've read this, you might know that. But it is absolutely hilarious book, A Confederacy of Dunces. Okay, so the next one I don't have a physical copy of, but it is Fanny Hill, Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure by John Cleland. This book was actually published in 1748, and this book is one that I was not expecting. So many times when I read books that are published in the 17 or 1800s, they're very sedate. You know, the love scenes, if there are any, are, oh, they went into the woods or things along that nature. This one, no. This one is risque by today's standards. Like, I was reading it going, I can't believe this was published in the 1700s. I can see why it was frequently banned and considered, not necessarily things that young women should be reading. But I loved it so much because it was just so out of place for the time. All right, so the next book is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. It was published in 1956. I read this one for the first time last year, and it broke my heart. It has a main character whose name is David, and David is dating a young man named Giovanni. His parents don't know. He has a fiance, and he ultimately ends up just. What happens to Giovanni is truly heartbreaking. It was one of my favorite reads of last year, though, but it is truly a heartbreaking book. The next one was a huge surprise off of the 1001 book list. I would have never suspected that I would have loved this book, and that is Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This was originally published in 1914. I have this beautiful edition here with both The Return of Tarzan and Tarzan of the Apes, and part of the reason why I loved this book so much is because I was familiar with the story of Tarzan of the Apes from movies, and this book, I loved the ending because it was not expected. So it was one of the big surprises from the 1001 book list that I did not anticipate that I would enjoy that one. The next one is a really fascinating one. which is called The Stone Diaries by Carol Shields, which was originally published in 1993. I have this as a 5-star in Goodreads. I don't know why it's a 5-star. It's going to have to go on a reread list because all I remember is that I loved it at the time, but the story did not stick with me. Have you read that one? I'm curious if you have more details about it. And then the last one from the 1001 Discovery pile is The Tin Flute by Gabrielle Yee or Roy. This features a family in Canada in right around World War II, and this book broke my heart. It made me cry. There were so many just characters that either made me mad or made me cry. I absolutely loved this book, and it's one I would have never picked up if it hadn't been for the 1001 book list. So those are the main ones that I picked out for the 1001 book list. The next books are a set of classics. And so for the classics, the first one that I have is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. I only have a flimsy paperback copy of this particular book. It is a phenomenal story, but it has a lot of detail about underwater life. It's the minutia of that sometimes can be a little bit hard to read, but that's the first one on the classics list. The next one is The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I have this bind up of all of the complete works of Sherlock Holmes. My favorite stories actually are like The Hound of the Baskervilles, but that is one of my 5-star, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And then the next book is one of the books that I credit for getting me into reading classics, and that is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. This is a brick, a monster. I don't remember it being this thick. I'm almost thinking that I read an abridged version of this book. But The Count of Monte Cristo, one of my all-time favorite books, and definitely got me into reading classics. The next one is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. This book was originally published in 1952, and I read this at the recommendation of my nephew and loved it. It is my favorite Steinbeck. I wish I could talk more about it in detail, but it's been a number of years since I've read it. Has always been one that has stuck with me a bit. So the next one on the classics list is a little bit more of a controversial one, which is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. This was originally published in 1939, and I remember reading this book. It was not a small book, and I read it over a weekend. I could not put it down. I know that there's a lot of just controversial content, her as an author, Margaret Mitchell as an author, and what she was trying to do with this book. I would love to reread it again and see what, now that my tastes have changed a little bit, what I think of the book. But it was one of my all-time favorites. The next one I read last year, which is Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. This features a family in the Great Depression, and they are trying to find work. Tom Joad is home from prison, and they immediately set off to California to try and get work, and it is their story. It is really a fascinating read. There's a lot of slang in this that's really hard to get used to. Once you kind of get used to that, though, and it kind of just becomes second nature, you don't even notice it anymore. But this is a classic copy that I believe my nephew gave me for Christmas one year. It's a little beat up, but it is an absolutely wonderful, wonderful read. The next book is an absolutely gorgeous book that I got fairly recently, and that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Look at how gorgeous this book is. This is another one that has absolutely amazing illustrations in it, and it has a bunch of different inserts again. I really like these editions because of all of like the little flowers and stuff in the end, and just how beautiful this copy is. But it also was a story that had been one of my favorites. It's one of the few books I actually own more than one copy of, and that I got this very beautiful illustrated edition. It's illustrated by Marjolaine Baskin. But look at just how beautiful this book is. I just absolutely love this one. But Jane Eyre is one of my all-time favorite classics. The next one is Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. It was originally published in 1997. And this is another book that has some controversy around it because when I look back now, what I've read is that Arthur Golden, while talking to a geisha, really did not keep necessarily the whole story. And so it's another one I really like to reread and see what I think of it now, but it was one that was on my 5-star list. And then the last one for the classic section is The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas. Dumas is one of the there's only a couple authors that have more than one book on my list of 50. This book was fantastic. It's another brick of a book, but I absolutely adored this one. I think I read it pretty closely on the heels of The Count of Monte Cristo because I just love the characters in this particular book, and lots of interesting, strong women characters in this book, but The Three Musketeers. And we are now going to number 19. So we're not quite halfway through. The next book is actually one of the only fantasy books on the list, which is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, which was originally published in 1954. I read this last year and adored all 3 books. I read The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. And I also actually read The Hobbit, but I enjoyed The Lord of the Rings far more than any of the others. The thing that really surprised me is just comparing it to the movies, how different it was. The length of time before they actually start on their adventures and the ages of the hobbits were completely different than what I understood from the movie to the book comparison. So yeah, Lord of the Rings. And then now we're going into just general fiction. And so the first book in the general fiction mix is Burnt Sugar by Abdi Dashi. I read this last year. This book hit me really, really hard. There's also representation for Alzheimer's in this particular book, and we have one family member that we lost due to Alzheimer's and another one going through it now, and so it just hit all kinds of personal connections with me, but I absolutely adored this particular book last year. The next one is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. It was one of the books that was shortlisted, I believe, for the Women's Prize last year, and I loved the story of the main character. I didn't like so much the current timeline that was in it, but it was a great book from last year. The next one that I read, or that I have, is Greenwood by Michael Christie. This book has varying different timelines in it. It starts in the future, works its way backwards, and then comes all the way back to the future again. I couldn't put this book down. I love this cover as well. I found it to be a fascinating book, but I really appreciate books about the outdoors. This one really had to do a lot with the destruction of forests, which is very hard to read, but I did love that one quite a bit. Okay, so the next one is Magic Lessons by Alice Hoffman, which was published in 2020, which was a prequel to Practical Magic. I loved reading the backstory of this. I'd seen the movie Practical Magic, so some of the things that were referenced in the book, I really enjoyed just learning more about that particular story. The next one is Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King, which was published in 1982. This story is Andy Dufresne, who is convicted of murdering his wife and ends up at Shawshank Prison. The Shawshank Redemption is one of my all-time favorite movies. I mean, number one, if you were to ask me, that's the movie I'm going to tell you is my favorite movie. And the book did not disappoint as well. It was very, very well done. It's amazing how they took this very short novella and made it into this phenomenal movie that is The Shawshank Redemption. So yeah, that one definitely had to be there. The next one is The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. This was published in 2021. This is one of the few newer releases. This book follows a character again in the Great Depression. It is very reminiscent of The Grapes of Wrath, but it has a female as the main character in it. And all I can tell you about this book is reading it made me so sad. The main character made me sad. She just everything she went through and how her parents treated her entire life, it just made me so incredibly sad. It was such a good book, but it did make me cry. It gave me a book hangover for multiple days. I really enjoyed that one quite a bit. The next one, so we're on book number 25, halfway, is The Help by Catherine Stockett. It was originally published in 2009, and it is a fantastic story of a woman who comes home from college, and her maid that she's had forever, the person who took care of her when she was young, is no longer there. She's trying to figure out what happened to her. This is set in, I believe, the 1950s, 1960s, with maids and caretakers who were predominantly Black women, and it was how she pulled and told the story of those women. I've heard some criticism of the book. I read A Little Devil in America this year, and that gave me a slightly different perspective of this book, but it is one of my favorite books. I love just how the story came together and how it was told, and it was adapted into a phenomenal movie. All right, moving on. The next one is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, and this one was published in 2020, and this one I really liked because it had a bit of a different premise for me. It has a character who basically makes a deal with a devil-like character to get out of having to live the life she is, and she gets to do all these different things, but the trick is no one remembers her. The second she walks out of the room and comes back in, no one will remember her name. She's seen as a stranger. And so the one criticism of this book is it can be a bit repetitive, but it was really an interesting concept and one I had trouble putting down last year. All right, the next one is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, which was again published in 2020. And this one, I really love this concept of going in. This woman has attempted to commit suicide and ends up in a library where she can change any aspect of her life and see what that life would have been like to live. Everything from big decisions to minor decisions can be made in this library, coming to the culmination at the very end. The one thing that people have said, or what a couple of my friends have said about this book, is that it was predictable as far as how it would end, but I really enjoyed that one quite a bit. The next one is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. It was originally published in 2015. I am a big fan of World War II stories, and this one was all set in the World War II. I really like the premise of this one as well, and really like Kristen Hanna's writing quite a bit. All right, book number 29 is The Secret Life of Bees by Sue Monk Kidd. It was originally published in 2001. There's something about the little girl in this story that really appealed to me. She basically runs away from home, and there's just a lot of just interactions with where she goes with these beekeepers. From what I remember, I could be remembering it completely wrong, but I absolutely adored that particular story because of the little girl. Anytime you give that kind of that relationship in there, I think it's really fascinating. All right, so book number 30 is The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. This one, I love this book so much. I just watched the series on HBO Max for The Time Traveler's Wife. So if you're not familiar with this book, it has Claire and Henry is a time traveler and starts to visit her when she is a young girl, and then it goes to where they meet when she is in her 20s, all the way up through their marriage and their life together. And so you get this perspective of meeting them through one perspective, one person's eyes, and then you get to see it from the other perspective, which is truly really a fascinating way of doing this story. It's heartbreaking. I absolutely love this book, though. It's one of my 50 favorites. Okay, I'll stop saying that now. All right, so that is really the end. That is really the end of just general fiction. So the next books that I have one graphic novel on the list, which is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This book documents her time in Iran at a time when my husband was actually living there. It is really an interesting graphic novel. I don't read a lot of graphic novels, but I think it hit me so much because it had such a personal connection to my family. All right, so the next ones are really middle grade books. There's 4 middle grade books. The first one is Pippi Longstocking by Astrid Lindgren. It was originally published in 1945. It features a carefree girl who has, I think, a dog named Horse, if I remember correctly, or a horse named Dog. I can't remember which one of those, but I remember just being delighted by this story and so surprised that I loved this story as much as I did. It was also one that I read because of the 1,001 book list. But yeah, Pippi Longstocking. The next one is The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis, which was originally published in 1955. This is the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia series. And so when I read this particular one, I loved learning about the origin of Narnia and the rings and just how the kids get there and how the evil witch is created. All of those pieces were just truly magical for me, and I liked it far more than I liked the other books in the series. And then the next middle grade is Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls. This book made me cry. It has Billy and his two dogs in it, all the things he goes through to get his dogs, how much he loves them, how having those dogs changed his life, changed his family's life. It is truly an inspiring story, but oh man, did it make me cry. Absolutely love that book though. Okay, and then the last middle grade book is Wonder by R.J. Palacio. I just read this last year and adored it. It is all about a story of friendship, about accepting people for who they are, accepting yourself for who they are, about miscommunication. It is truly an absolutely wonderful book, and is great for all ages and not just middle grade. It deserves definitely be on this list. All right, so the next book is the one and only mystery book that's on there, and it is And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I reread this last year, and it's one of those books I wish I could go back and read not knowing the ending, because I loved this book again when I read it last year. I was still surprised by it. It was absolutely my favorite Agatha Christie above any others. All right, so the next books are all in nonfiction category. So the first one is Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. It is a autobiography of his time in Africa, and he is hilarious in this book. There's a lot in this that is not supposed to be funny. It was basically because he was, I believe his mom was white and his dad was black, or vice versa. I can't remember which way now. But it was literally a crime for him to be born. And so there's a lot of things that he makes fun of in this book that aren't necessarily funny, but he is hilarious. It was a wonderful autobiography. All right, so the next one is Chasing Me to My Grave by Winfred Rember. It was published in 2021. It won the Pulitzer Prize in biography last year, and it deserved it. It is the story of Winfred growing up in the Jim Crow South and all of his trials that he went through. He ended up in prison for a time. He also learned how to work leather while in prison and became a very great artist with that. And it's absolutely amazing to read the book, because as you go through it, you have times where you just you turn the page and it's just heartbreaking, the artwork that's there that demonstrates what actually happened in his life. All right, the next one is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, which was originally published in 1969. It's a book that is frequently banned for a lot of its content. I remember reading it and thinking it was just absolutely beautiful. It's poetry on the page is what I would call it. Absolutely amazing book. Okay, so the next one is Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb, which was originally published in 2019. This is kind of a self-help book. It's very much not in my wheelhouse, but I read it and loved it. It is a therapist talking about her own therapy, which I found truly, truly fascinating, and how just sometimes you need to reach out and ask for help, which I thought was a really fascinating one. I did read it in 2020 during the pandemic, the height of the beginning of the pandemic. Maybe that had something to do with why I liked it so much. All right, book number 41 is a book of poetry, which is The Sun and Her Flowers by Rupi Kaur. It was originally published in 2017. I loved this book of poetry. It was absolutely, truly amazing. I don't, like I said, read a lot of poetry, but there were so many sections in this book that just spoke to me. So yeah, that's my one book of poetry. The next nonfiction book is Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand, which is a fantastic survival story set in World War II by Louis Zamperini, I believe was his name. He was an Olympic runner, and he was on a plane that was shot down, ended up in a Japanese prisoner of war camp where they truly tried to break him. It was horrific, the stories that are in that book. And then all the problems he had once he came home. It was very inspirational, but very, very harrowing. The next one is Wild by Cheryl Strayed, which was published in 2012. This one has a special place in my heart because it is the story of her hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, or the PCT, which is in my neck of the woods, after the death of her mother. And so much of this, when I was reading it, just rang so true for when you're out hiking. She was not super prepared. She did not have a lot of experience, and it reads like that on the page. There was just a lot of points in it, like there's some things with her toes and her losing her boots that I just know how I would have reacted. And so for me, it was an interesting one to read because I felt like I was that character as she was going through everything. All right, book number 44 is Winter Dance. I have that one here. Winter Dance by Gary Paulsen. This is the story of Gary Paulsen running the Iditarod for the first time and his path to getting there. It is absolutely magnificent and hilarious. If you have not read this book and you like books about the outdoors, this is one I would absolutely put at the top of the list to read. I laughed out loud at parts of this book. Parts of it aren't necessarily funny. There's some pieces that, dangerous components and animals that get hurt, things of that nature in this book. But there is a ton of humor in this book. And one of my favorite sections is when he's getting ready to start the Iditarod and he decides to switch out the lead dogs, but the brake that he has isn't going to work well, and he said he had a very Wilson guided tour of downtown Anchorage, and it made me giggle because I could imagine someone just going through Anchorage unable to stop because they made a stupid decision right at the beginning. And so but Gary Paulsen's humor comes through so well in this book. I have read Hatchet by Gary Paulsen as well and really like that, but this one is my top one and the last of the nonfiction books. All right, we're getting there, so we only have a few more. The next one is my favorite series of all time, which I only put the first book on the list, which is Naked in Death by J.D. Robb. This follows a character whose name is Eve Dallas. She's a police detective set in the future who investigates murders with her billionaire husband and a wide cast of characters. I can read these books over and over and over again. Absolutely, truly love them. And the only other romancy novel I have on there is a series that is by Susan Stoker, and it's called Shielding Riley is the book that I had as 5-star, but these are basically military romance series, and any of them would fall into this category. It's my brain candy. It's what I'll go to when I can't really focus too much. I will go and read these particular novels. I do love them quite a bit. And the next 3 are the only sci-fi on the list, and 2 of them are by the same author. So the first one is The Martian by Andy Weir. I adored this book. I flew through this book. I recommended it to my husband and he loved it. The Martian has a character whose name is Mark Watney who gets left behind on Mars during a mission. They think he's dead and he has to try and survive while they're trying to figure out how to rescue him. And it is snarky and funny and harrowing and just interesting. It is a great introduction into kind of a science fiction genre as far as a book goes, or as far as the genre that I don't read a lot of. It was truly one of my favorite books that I read. It was published back in 2011 and it was just phenomenal. Along with that, Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir also did make this list. It was a different kind of a story and there were parts of it that I didn't like as much as The Martian, but it still ended up being on my top 50. But both of them have the similar kind of snarky humor that I just absolutely adore. And the last one in sci-fi is Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, which was also published in 2011. And this one was, for me, the reason why I loved it so much was all the 80s nostalgia in this. It rang so true to me for everything that I knew in the 80s, and I just absolutely adored all of that, all those references in this book. As part of the reason why I like the series Stranger Things on Netflix. If you haven't seen that, it is nightmare inducing, but a similar thing, lots of 80s nostalgia, which is when I grew up. And so it ended up being one of my favorite books that I read. I did not like the adaptation of it at all, but I loved the book. And the last book is the only thriller that made the list, and it is An Anonymous Girl by Greer Hendricks. It was published in 2019. And this book is one of those, again, that I don't have a lot of detail about. I just remember reading it and thinking I couldn't figure out what was going on. I couldn't figure out who it was. And I didn't put a lot of notes on my Goodreads shelf for it, but it is one that made my top 50. And that's the 50s. Editing Sandy here. If you're paying attention, that was only 49 books because somehow I left off one. So the book I forgot is The Godfather by Mario Puzo. It is one that I did read because of the 1001 book list, and it is one that the fantastic movies, the Godfather movies, are based off of. They are adapted from that particular book. The book was really, really well done though, and it's one that, even though I forgot about, is mentioning it, was one of the great ones that I found from the 1001 book list. So now we're at 50. Yay! Yay! I made it. So just just 50 of the books that are some of my favorites, ones that have stuck with me, or ones I definitely want to try and reread if they didn't stick with me as much as I had hoped. helped. And how many of these, curious in the comments, how many of these have you read? How many of these do you want to read? Are there any on here that you think I'm crazy, they shouldn't be on there? Happy to hear that as well. But I just thought I would give you some of my favorites to go along with the list of 50 of books that were just a weird list. But as always, like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, everyone, thanks. Bye.